Hi, this is Paul, and this is Rough Draft for Sunday, where I run through my current version of my Sunday sermon. If you have feedback, leave a comment. It's always good to get comments before I preach it. Sometimes you point out things I didn't think of, and I adjust it. And if you're curious about what I finally do preach, you can find that on the Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church YouTube channel on Sunday morning, and see what we did. The Gospel of John tells the story of Jesus differently from Matthew, Luke, and Mark. The Gospel of John has this prologue that continues to shake and shape history. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us. John the Baptist declares, "Behold the Lamb of God." And we have the book of signs. Jesus sees Nathanael under a tree. Jesus turns water to wine at Cana. Jesus clears the temple courts. Jesus tells Nicodemus he must be born from above. Jesus tells the Samaritan woman everything she's ever done. The book of signs is, in fact, full of signs. Now, Jesus, if you're curious about where we pick up, it's after last week. You can go and find last week's rough draft or last week's sermon. After the 2 days that he was in Samaria, in Sychar, with the people of the village there, he left for Galilee. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had all seen what he had done in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, for they also had been there. Now, it's pretty easy to see that Galileans would regularly go down to Jerusalem for festivals, and many of them probably had family who lived nearby, and so they'd stay down below in the Galilee, and they'd stay above there. And what has puzzled scholars about this passage, though, is that Jesus is well received by the Galileans. He's welcomed, and yet there's this comment that he has no honor in his own country. What could this be talking about? Now, we'll get into this as we continue to read the passage, but I have a friend, Rod Hugan, who pastors a church in Tucson, and he often comments about the clapping gods. What are the clapping gods? He makes the point that in many ways, affirmation and approval are far more enticing for us than criticism. And everyone wants to shape Jesus. He's been doing these signs. He's been doing these miracles. He's very popular because of them. Jesus, do more signs, do more miracles. Fix our problems, answer our questions, make the world closer to what we think it should be. In John chapter 2, there's a very haunting verse, but Jesus would not entrust himself to them, meaning the people, for he knew all people. He understands that they have designs for him, and they understands that this may not be along the path that he knows he needs to follow. And, well, we'll bump into this again and again and again as we follow Jesus' journey. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. John is just reminding us here so that we don't forget. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick at Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to come and heal his son, who was close to death. Now, all the way back to the church father Irenaeus, there's been a lot of speculation as to, well, what's behind this story? Because in Matthew 8 and in Luke 7, there's a similar story with a centurion who has a sick servant. Now, the language between son and servant is a little bit ambiguous, and so many have speculated, well, this is the same story. It's just told from a different account. And in fact, this seems to be quite a different account, sort of in the sense of, well, two different witnesses, two different accounts. Now, John again is noting Cana to draw attention to the miracles that Jesus has done. And I think what this is a story about is really a story about our hearts. Because the next verse has Jesus saying, "Unless you people see signs and wonders," Jesus told him, "you will never believe." Now, it's often the case that Jesus says and does something that we look at and say, that wasn't very nice. This man is clearly anxious, panicked, worried about his son who is dying. Here is Jesus, the miracle worker, who has come close enough so that he can get his attention. And so he goes to him frantically and says, "Jesus, my son is dying." And Jesus gives him a little lecture about you people. Signs and wonders have been central, as we've seen, to the Gospel of John. This is the book of signs. Nathanael, he saw under a tree. The miracle at Cana of water to wine, the disciples entrusted themselves to him because of that. Nicodemus says to Jesus, "We know you've come from God because of the signs." The woman at the well, her mind is changed because he's told me everything I've ever done. But Jesus is making a point here that he's not simply a wonder worker. He is not an on-call divine butler or specialist who will somehow get your problems fixed. But Jesus, this man's son, is dying. Jesus is calm, even when the man is quite obviously panicky. What did we learn? Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. But the man won't be deterred. The royal official said, "Sir, come down before my child dies." "Go," Jesus replied, "your son will live." The man took Jesus at his word and departed. While he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his boy was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, "Yesterday at 1 p.m, the fever left him." Then the father realized this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." So he and his household believed. Notice the faith of this man. He doesn't demand, "Jesus, please come." He simply takes Jesus at his word and leaves in faith. It's remarkable faith. And then John notes, this is the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. What does it mean that they are believing in him? Now, are they going to church? Well, there is no church to go to. Are they lighting a candle? Are they setting up a shrine? What on earth do these phrases mean? We're finding them again and again. Now with the disciples continue to follow him, but the people in Samaria stay in their town. The servants in Cana probably continue to whisper and remark about the water to wine thing. Nicodemus says he's from God. The Samaritan woman calls him a prophet, and the Samaritan village says he's the savior of the world. But how does that actually pan out in their lives? Does it endure? How do they change? What do they do? Now, in my strange YouTube odyssey, I often do commentary on other things I find on the internet. A couple of weeks ago, Michaela Peterson, who is the daughter of Jordan Peterson, has recently been exploring Christianity and finding God. The other woman we're going to look at is Audrey Assad, who makes beautiful music, often Christian music, music I particularly enjoy. Now, faith often begins with asking God for deliverance. Michaela Peterson grew up with childhood arthritis. She had numerous surgeries. She had all kinds of medical interventions. And by the time she got to college, nothing really seemed to work. Eventually, she changed her diet. And by virtue of her change of diet and her father's fame, she's had a little bit of fame herself, a significant YouTube channel and a bunch of different things. But she's had her ups and downs with her father's illness, with her own celebrity, having a child, and then, in fact, facing divorce. And at one point, everything seemed to be going wrong in her life, and Christian friends of her basically said, "Why don't you ask God for help?" And she did, and she saw an immediate enough turnaround of a whole bunch of situations that she began to believe. Signs and wonders still happen today. Asking God for help. Many people do so out of desperation, and if the situation improves, well, worth following up on, right? It is. Does this work? What do we mean by work? Sometimes our prayers are not answered. Sometimes faith seems too heavy to carry. Audrey Assad grew up in a conservative Christian household. She had a career making Christian music. She had a particular kind of religious scrupulosity, sort of like obsessive compulsive disorder, especially attuned to religious issues. She's been all over the map, in and out of churches, and most recently telling her story about how she's deconstructed, which is the trendy word for sort of leaving the faith behind. She's full of questions about morality. She's full of questions about plausibility. And she, like many, walks away from the faith, often in sorrow and grief. Doesn't want to leave the faith, just doesn't believe it anymore. One who was raised without it cries out to God, sees some signs, and pursues. Others who have been crying out to God much of their lives don't see enough response and leaves. Is this story in John the same story as the centurion? I can't answer that question, but there certainly are parallels. The centurion replied, "Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. And I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. And he said to those following him, Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Here the one who grew up without God discovers God, and his faith is remarkable. It takes a lot to amaze Jesus, who sees Nathanael under a tree and tells the Samaritan woman everything she's ever done. This man is a member of a pagan army occupying God's holy land and his holy people. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west and take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, "Go, let it be done just as you believed it would." And his servant was healed at that moment. Life is hard. Loss is real. Christ Church and his people fail, sometimes dramatically. We are junkies for results. We really are. What we think needs to happen, if it doesn't, we lose faith. What seems most obvious, right, good, and true, when it doesn't happen, we say, must not be the answer. Jesus does not entrust himself to us because he knows our hearts. But this man who did no violence to anyone was crucified. This man who healed the sick and raised the dead. This man who refused to get in line with the agenda to resist the pagan oppression of God's holy land and his holy people. Who brought rare agreement between the oppressed and the oppressors that the world would be better without him. Whose disciples hid in shame and despondence at his execution. Who did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Who prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing," while his executioners took his life. Who cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And the sky still turned to darkness, and people wept and gnashed their teeth. This man who is our pioneer in how to live through a culture war, through the age of decay, into death, into resurrection, and creation 2.0. Saints, persevere. We may be seeking signs and wonders. We may learn that the path of faith is long and often hard. Sometimes we might cry out to God and receive the answers we want, Sometimes we might call out to him, and it feels like a shut door, a cruel joke. But saints, persevere. We hold on even when it seems we've got nothing to hold on to. The righteous will live by faith. Even when he gives a dismissive comment about signs and wonders, we pursue him and say, it only takes a word. If you say the word, I'll believe you and I'll follow. We still cling to him in faith and ask him to make this world whole. On the night that he was betrayed, he took bread and broke it and said, this is my body broken for you. He took a cup and poured it out and said, this is a new covenant in my blood. Whenever you drink this, do so in remembrance of me.